thought everyone might be a bit more enthusiastic having had a nice coffee or some caffeine. So, yeah, good morning. I'm David, co-founder of Net Zero International. So we are part, to keep sort of BIM's three-word analogy, we're part of Carbon AAA. And the three elements of Carbon AAA are accounting, accreditation, and advice. So what we do is we help businesses understand what their carbon footprint is through an accounting system. We then help businesses to accredit what their emissions are to United Nations Race to Zero standards. And then we also offer partnership in terms of solutions and offer advice to help organisations to really understand how they're going to get to net zero by 2050. Because as mentioned earlier, being net zero by 2050 is actually going to be a legal requirement for all businesses. Okay, so I've got the dubious task of going through how to talk about carbon emissions and try and keep it as exciting as possible. And I was just talking to my colleagues here, I'm not going to be like Jon Snow used to be, you know, with the sort of election nights and showing loads of graphs and stuff like that if possible. But I am going to try and keep it as fundamental and as simple as possible. If for those of us old enough, remember the old Windows for Dummies books, we sort of talk about this as being a bit net zero for dummies, probably more likely to be called net zero for fundamentals. So, hands up. Who knows what net zero actually means? Who could honestly stand up and tell everyone what the definition of net zero is? Because I've heard net zero mentioned a lot this morning. Okay? Hands up who could talk about what the difference is between net zero and carbon neutral. Keep your hands up. Okay? Yeah, that's probably representative of most audiences we talk to. Normally about 80% of people don't actually know the definition. Now I said I'm going to keep it simple. So this is the definition of net zero for you. But you'll be pleased to say I can keep it simple. So we reduce it down to 12 words, okay? And what it is greenhouse gas emissions are mitigated and those that cannot are offset. So what that means is looking at the emissions in your organisation, reducing them as far as possible, and for those that you cannot, you would then offset by investing in either offset projects or avoidance projects, and I'll explain that in a second. Okay? We use the word mitigate specifically because mitigation means making less severe. And as we've already talked about earlier on today, the climate change is definitely going to be a severe consequence for us as people if we don't start to take action quickly. Okay? I'm now going to show you in graphical form how it works. Okay? This is actually one of our clients. So it's a large, transportation seems to be a theme of the day. A large transportation business, they've got about 20,000 vehicles on the road. They used a benchmark year. So what you start with is a benchmark year. So you work out the emissions for a year and that's your benchmark. And you then have to reduce your emissions as far as possible by 2050 to be able to say that you're net zero. Okay, so this is the actual change that this organisation has planned. Their original emissions at the front, it's about 512,000 tonnes. So 500,000 tonnes they're emitting. They've got a big plan there, you can see between 25 and 35 where they're going to decarbonise their fleet. So those 20,000 vehicles, they're going to start investing in electric, hydrogen, biofuel and other technologies I'm sure that will come that way. And then by 2050, they're going to get, they think, to about 20% of where they are currently. Okay? So they're still going to be emitting a large amount of carbon, 100,000 tonnes of carbon. So what they're going to do to be able to call themselves net zero is they're going to offset those elements of carbon that they can't reduce out of their business, they can't take out of their business. And that's the true definition of net zero. To be net zero, according to the Science Based Target Initiative, which is the SBTI, you'll have heard of it, is 90% as an idea. So 90% reduction from your benchmark baseline year by 2050. And then you offset those last bits you can't. Okay? So I asked you if you know the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. And I mentioned earlier, Richard talked about the country has a legal requirement to be, all businesses to be net zero by 2050. The Hearts Council have said they're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. So there's a fundamental difference between those two things. And the difference is, to be carbon neutral, you offset at any point in that transition all of your carbon, and then you can say you are carbon neutral. So with the council, it would be at 2030. This business isn't going to do that, by the way. we're not going to advise this business to go and invest in 375,000 tonnes worth of offsets to say they're carbon neutral, because when I start talking about scopes, you understand that's not all of their emissions because they're not measuring everything. Okay, so if you want to be carbon neutral, you offset all the emissions you have, but to be net zero, you've got to reduce your emissions as far as possible. Okay, you may have heard of the term carbon positive. That would mean when offsets go above emissions. So that means you're offsetting more than you're emitting. That can also, again, confusingly also be called carbon negative. So it could be carbon negative or carbon positive, just to keep it simple for you, as I promised I would do. Okay? Now, Andrew showed this slide earlier, and I just want to explain how we measure emissions. Okay? So you have what's called the GHG protocol, which is the greenhouse gas protocol. It's the internationally recognised way of actually measuring emissions. And there are 3 different scopes. You've got scope 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to go into that into a little bit of detail on the next slide. Scope 3 is the most challenging element because that's your supply chain. So for large organisations, it's a challenge because they need to understand their supply chain emissions. And for those of you who are a supplier to larger organisations, it's also a challenge because you need to be able to tell the organisation you're working with what your emissions are. And there are 15 different categories of scope 3. 5 of those are now mandatory in what's called the PPN 0621. So again, trying not to be complicated and technical, but the UK government, as of October, requires any business that wants to win a £5 million tender to have a carbon reduction plan. And as part of that, they have to measure their scope 1 and their scope 2 and 5 elements of scope 3. Okay, those 5 elements are waste, business travel, employee commuting, and transportation and distribution of goods, both upstream, so from cradle to gate to get it into your business, and downstream, which is from your business to your supplier. And the reason those 5 have been chosen initially is because they are probably the data sets that are the easiest ones to get hold of. I'm going to ask a quick question again. Hands up who measures their employee commuting emissions currently. Oh, got a couple. So, indeed. So that's going to be a mandatory requirement soon to be able to measure the emissions of your commuting of your employees. And again, that's where the data, information, support will come into play. Okay? So that's a GHG protocol. Again, try and simplify it. Scope 1, the fuels you burn. So in the vehicles you own, promises you own, gas, petrol, diesel, and any refrigerants that you have from air conditioning refrigeration. Scope 2 is energy you buy, so generally electricity from the grid and any other purchased heat. And then say, scope 3, really the largest element, and it is about 90% of your emissions. So going back to that business that I was talking about we're working with, 500,000 tonnes, realistically their overall carbon emissions is probably near 5 million because they're not really measuring their scope 3, which is what we're starting to work with them because they've got 4,000 suppliers. And they are working it very much, going back again to Bim's point, about the strategic reasons for doing that and working with their suppliers. They understand that they need to do that now to win corporate and supply chain business. They need to do that and they need to get ahead. But it's really complicated. So we're actually working on a 3-year plan to address that with all of their suppliers. Okay? So that's how we measure it. And then how do we then put it in? So this is a shameless plug for our software that we use. And again, I'm out by the stall, so you can come and have a look and we can go through some real-life examples. So this is what we do. We take all the data, we put it into our software, and we create the emissions for you. Okay? We equate carbon in CO2e. So all of the different emissions are all put into CO2e. So again, it's as simple as possible. And in this example here, I don't know if there's a laser. I think there might be. Oh, here we go. Right, okay. Right, so this business here, its benchmark year had just over 123,000 kilograms, 123 tonnes. In the last year, it's emitted 106,000 tonnes. So, you know, against its benchmark, it's on a 14% reduction. Now, if I said to you, what does a tonne of carbon look like? You wouldn't really, no one knows what it looks like. So we equate it here to cars off the road, trees planted, plane miles. And again, just to put it in context, car miles, it's about 3,500 miles. So the average car, 3,500 miles, averagely is about a tonne of carbon, Average car does about 14,000 miles a year. So that's how we work that through to make it practical for our clients to understand. And then it looks at December and says, okay, in December, we reduced our carbon from the rolling year to November, again, by 4%, and you can see the values here. Okay? So again, very visual, updated monthly, and we embed the software in the organisations we work with so they can understand where their emissions are. They can share it with their suppliers, with their customers, with their colleagues, and we've spoken about all of the benefits of doing that. We then look by category. So again, here we look at this business, and again, we've not really done a lot in Scope 3 with this example. So 66% of it sits in energy, 23% in business travel, and a very small bit in employee commuting in that example, because as we probably know, when we were measuring some of this, not many of us were going to work. Okay? And then in the final one, we look by scope as well, and you can see there the percentages by scope. Completely customizable to each business. We customise Scope 3 metrics for all our different organisations, and again, that can all be done through the software. And then what we do is we train staff. You have a licence, you have this embedded into your business. So what we try to do with our organisations we work with is make carbon a cultural thing as opposed to a compliance thing. So if you want to go for a public sector tender, you have to do the PPN 0621. If you're a business over 250 people, you have to do SECR. The big organisations we generally work with are scrambling to get all that data together on a year basis. By embedding accounting, by embedding accreditation and advice into your organisation, it's there always and able to do. The smallest company, by the way, I'm talking about large companies, we work with a company of 6 people. Largest we work with is 22,000. So it really is every organisation of every size. And the reason for that is because strategically it makes sense for those organisations to embed carbon accounting as part of their overall ESG strategy. Okay, I'm delighted to say Fiona and the team here from JPA were just about to start working with Fiona and the team on their Scope 3, for example, because they've done some brilliant work around Scope 1 and 2, but it gets to Scope 3 and how do we unpeel that onion, and we're starting that work now, aren't we, on a couple of your projects with you, which is going to be great. Now, Andrew mentioned earlier as well about the Race to Zero. So we are accredited partners of Race to Zero through Future Net Zero. You'll see out on our stand if you'd like to come and sort of say hello to us over there. And there are 4 steps to joining Race to Zero. The first one is to pledge. So the pledge is you will get to net zero by, again, generally we tell businesses to start at 2050 because that's a good start and work backwards. It's much easier to do that than say, well, we're going to get there by 2030, not really know what your emissions are, and then realise actually that's going to be really tough. So we always start 2050 and work backwards. The next one is to have a plan. So actually get your plan in place. You need to understand your emissions to be able to have your plan, work with your team about how you think you can reduce your emissions. Then you proceed with that plan, and this is an annual audit that takes place. So check your audit, check to make sure that you are continuing with the plan you had. And the other thing we have to say with carbon accounting is this isn't going to be a single line all the way down. There's going to be some up and downs along this. Again, I'm sure there's very few businesses here that don't want to grow. Well, that probably means your emissions will go up, potentially. So what we do is we measure what's called carbon intensity metrics, and we look at the efficiency of the carbon you have within your organisation. So, for example, if you double in size, you probably don't need to double the size of your HQ or double the size of your employees. So we can measure the efficiency of the carbon that you are using, and that is a great metric to show that whilst you're growing more efficiently from a carbon perspective, as well as general financial quality and all those other metrics that you've probably had historically. And then the final one is you publish. So you tell your customers, your suppliers, your colleagues what you're doing. And again, I don't need to reiterate all the things that people have talked about today around the benefits for that, because it's absolutely critical. And then my final slide, I'm just getting told I want to make sure that excellent Nick and Rondi have got plenty of time before lunch. You may have heard of what greenwashing as well. And again, personal opinion, I think it's going to be the biggest scandal of the 2020s if we're not careful. So the Green Claims Code has now come into play. So the CMA have actually launched that from the beginning of this year. And there are 6 criteria that you have to be able to demonstrate to not fall foul of greenwashing. Okay? And I'm just going to couple out, be substantiated. Not sure how you can do that if you're not measuring what you're doing. And also be truthful and accurate. Don't go fast, go accurately. And again, talking to big clients about actually your emissions are going to be more this year than last year, but that's a good thing because you're measuring more things. Imagine some conversations we have with senior people. That's not normal business, is it, if you think about it? Carbon accounting is very different. Be truthful, be accurate. Thank you very much. Thank you.